In this video, I want to make a simple cabinet to hold all of my sanding supplies and my sander. At the moment, I keep all of my sanding discs in this drawer, and the problem with that is that I never know when I'm running low of any particular grit sanding discs. I also have the same problem with my wet and dry sandpaper, which I keep here under my workbench. And I've run out of space in the cabinet under my miter station where I keep all of my tools, so my new random orbit sander needs a new home too. I decided to remove my whiteboard from the workshop as I thought that a sanding cabinet would be a better use of the wall space. For this build I'm going to use some 12mm plywood. This is just cheap low grade stuff. I tend to not use good quality materials for workshop projects like this one. I first set my table saw fence to 155mm, which would be the depth of the cabinet, as my biggest sanding discs are 150mm in diameter. I ripped all of the pieces of ply that I had to that width. Some of the pieces I had to work with were slightly narrower than the 155mm that I was hoping for, but they would still be wide enough to hold sanding discs, so I tweaked my design a bit so that the upper shelves would be slightly narrower. I did this purely just to make the best use out of the materials I had. Next I set up a stop block at my miter station to the width I wanted the cabinet to be, and I cut two pieces, the top and bottom panels. Then I set up the stop block to cut the two pieces for the side panels. And then I set the stop block to what would be the internal width of the cabinet and cut the pieces for the shelves. I needed some section dividers too, so I ripped some thin pieces of ply on my table saw. I cut the section dividers to length, which would be the same as the depth of each of the shelves. I used a push stick to hold down the workpiece here, so I could keep my fingers a safe distance from the blade. I sanded all of the pieces at 120 grit. It was much easier to do this before assembling while I had good access to all of the pieces. To assemble, I just used wood glue and brad nails, and I used my speed square to help keep everything square. Then I could add the section dividers to the inside with glue and brad nails too. I used a scrap of plywood cut to the width of the sections as a spacer to keep the size of each section consistent. Then I could add the shelf below, working from top down, and I used another section divider to get the spacing right for the shelves before adding nails through the side panels to secure the shelf. I kept repeating this process until all of the shelves were added. When I got to the bottom shelf, it was a little bit tight to get my nailer inside the cabinet. In hindsight, what would have been easier would have been to assemble the shell of the cabinet without the bottom panel, so just the top and side panels, and then add the shelves internally, and then add the bottom panel last. But I managed to get a couple of nails in from the back of the cabinet with the nailer held at an angle, and at the front I just used a couple of clamps to get the joints nice and tight. I used some wood filler to fill all of the nail holes and any exposed voids between the layers of ply. Once the filler was dry, I gave the cabinet another sanding, first with my random orbit sander, and then I eased over the sharp edges of all of the shelves by hand with 120 grit. I decided to paint the outside of the cabinet, mainly just to help it blend in with the walls and help bounce the light around a little more. I used primer and undercoat first, and then a couple of hours later applied some white silk paint off camera. To hang the cabinet on the wall, I'd use French cleats. I tilted my table saw blade to 45 degrees and ripped a thin piece of spruce roughly down the middle, and then I marked up the width of the cabinet onto the piece that would be secured to the back of the cabinet and cut it to length. I added the cleat to the back of the cabinet with glue and brad nails. I also added another piece of the spruce, which was the same thickness, to the bottom of the cabinet in the same way. This is just a spacer so that the cabinet hangs level on the wall. The other half of the French cleat was mounted to the uprights of my workshop wall with screws. I used a small spirit level to make sure it was level. Then I could add my discs to each section. I wrote the grits that I use on the front of the shelf with the Sharpie pen. I tend to always buy the same grits of sanding discs, 240, 120, 80, 60 and 40. So I designed my cabinet to hold those. I also always buy the same grits of wet and dry paper, which are 1200, 600, 400 and 240. So I designed this cabinet to hold those too. I usually tend to use only small pieces of wet and dry paper each time I use it, but occasionally I use a half sheet in the long direction, for example when flattening the sole of a hand plane. So I figured I could fold them and rip them all in half and store them like that. I couldn't think of a time when I've ever used a whole sheet, so this would work out fine for me. I had two small sections left over. One of those I'd use to store whichever sanding base wasn't already on my sander, because my new sander came with both a 150 and a 125mm base. And the other small section would be useful for storing my grinding discs. And the bottom shelf would accommodate the sander itself. I also added a nail to the side of the cabinet to store the spanner which came with my sander for swapping over the different sized sanding bases. So that was a really simple and quick project. It took around 3 hours in total to build, and it's really nice to be able to see at a glance what sanding supplies I have left. The top of the cabinet is useful too as another shelf. Any horizontal surfaces in my workshop tend to get filled pretty quickly, as you can see. I hope you enjoyed this video. Please subscribe if you haven't already for more weekly woodworking videos, and thank you for watching.